saddlery and our sport horse problem solver book event. Of course, Eric is an accomplished rider representing Ireland at European, World, and 4 Olympic Games, competing at badminton numerous times. He starts and brings along his own horses, solves his own problems, I'm sure. He's a fellow of the British Horse Society. He's also a fantastic teacher, not only for Olympic level riders, but for someone like me. So I have a quick story to illustrate that. First, I owe my horses Tom and Tiny to Eric. And I came to know the powers of observation and watching horses firsthand when I was in Ireland with Eric, looking for these 2 horses who were life-changing animals for me. So I'm very grateful for Eric for that. And then I put all of Eric's coaching skills to the test for many years, but particularly the year that I moved up to prelim at Groton House, and my good friend Jennifer Eddy was my partner in crime there. And I was so nervous that I had a friend was spoon feeding me pieces of watermelon before I went cross country. But I walked the course with Eric, and not only was it my debut at prelim, and Groton House for me is a huge emotional event. I grew up on it, so it was requiring a lot of me. My mother was there, so that was challenging. The other thing that debuted at Groton House that year was a fence called the Mustang Trap. And it wasn't the only tricky fence on the course. There was also the wing nut, the road crossing, the iconic water jump, the steps. And as we're walking the course with Eric and we got to the Mustang Trap, he said, "It's just a gymnastic exercise." And then we got to the water jump and he said, "It's just a gymnastic exercise." So that was my vision when I went out on course, and both Jennifer and I jumped clean, and that Mustang Trap wiped out more than half our division. So I know that you're going to speak today about language in when we get going here, but that was an example of very simple, direct language that helped call up forward, straight, regular, and it was just a gymnastic exercise. So with that, I'm going to say, here we have live from Dorset, Eric Smiley. And we're going to begin with hearing from him about the concept of the book and how it evolved.
Annie, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Stratford Saddlery, for inviting me to this and for hosting it. It's nice to be back inside your tack shop. I have very happy memories of being there and all the assembled people there, of who I think I know everyone. The book was an interesting thing after the last book, the Two Brains book. It was a case of, I remember Martha sitting there chatting to me and saying, and Becca as well, saying, do you think there's another book there, Eric? And I sort of said, give me peace, just don't talk to me for a year or two till I get the last out of the way. And then the more I sort of sat and thought about the thought process of maybe doing another one, that sort of coincided with lockdown a little bit, when we all were enforced to sit inside and try and find something else to do with our time, because we couldn't go outside and do our normal lives. And so lockdown focused the mind a little bit more. And we went through a couple of discussions with Trafalgar Square Books on what might be a nice idea. But one of the thoughts that I had in mind and always did have is that everyone who writes books sort of joins a club of being the expert in whatever subject they talk about. And as they begin to sit down and write the book, they begin to talk about being the expert. And I'm going to read a little bit about that in a second. But every time you sit down and try and think about writing a book, you really have to decide, from my point of view, A, what you want to put across and what is the subject that you're trying to get across. How do you then get to the people that you want to get to? And how do you avoid sounding like an expert? Yet you are an expert, because you wouldn't want to sit and write the book in the first place if you weren't half sensible about it. But how do you stop sounding like an expert? Because everyone who wants to be an expert writes a book in a way that they're joining the club of those that know. So I tried to turn it around the other way and said to myself, well, let's treat it a bit more like a clinic, because I go to a clinic and teach a clinic, and no one ever comes to me saying, my horse is going really well. I don't have anything to learn from you, but I just thought I'd come anyway. No one ever comes to a clinic with that sort of thought process. They come to a clinic saying, I've got this problem, that problem, this doesn't work, that doesn't work, I've had difficulties with this, and so they're always bringing you problems. And if they're bringing you problems, then it's my job as a clinician to try and resolve their problems and try and give them some way forward. So why not write a book about that thought process? Why not turn it around the other way and say, the book is from the point of view of these things go wrong. How do we try and solve some of the problems and give people a clue of problem solving? And I have to say, Martha and Becca were quite upbeat about the thought process, because they could see where I was coming from and what I could offer to that sort of a book, which is turning it around the other way. And the more I thought about it, the more I liked that concept about doing it that way. But equally, there were lots of difficulties in trying to think about what could appear a very negative book, because you're talking about problems and problem solving, and it's actually quite difficult then to turn that around into a positive. And as you guys know, I try really hard with all my teaching to end up being the positive person and give you solutions to problems, not highlight the problems, but to give you solutions, to give you thought processes of how you in your own sort of ways can solve the problems. So I needed to try and make whatever I was going to write, A, sort of sound like me, and B, be presentable, that it could be humorous, light, as well as informative. So I then started to think about finding someone who could do my graphic designs and my pictures. And the same person who lives quite locally to me and is very helpful to me, and really a nice girl. She's a graphic designer for Horse and Hound magazine, and was just really helpful and said, sure, anything you want to do, just send the pictures to me and I'll do them. And if I wanted something changed, she was on it. She said, it's no problem. Anything I'll change, I'll do anything you want. It's only right when you say it's right. And then the next thing I tried to do was find a cartoonist. And again, I found that quite difficult, because cartoonists have their own way of presenting things. And I looked through half a dozen cartoonists in various magazines, and I found someone who we chatted. She sent me a few rough, raw diagrams of what she could do. And I actually really liked her humor and her understanding of what I was trying to present in illustrating some of the humorous side to the problems that we all tend to encounter in our riding. And so with a combination of the cartoonist, the graphic designer, and what I was going to write, it seemed to gel into a nice sort of way of presenting things. And to that end, Martha and Becca said, we've given you Kate Adams to be your editor. And that was that was probably more interesting for Kate than it was for me, because Kate, I think, found it quite difficult to understand and get into me and understand me. So I'm very eternally grateful for Kate sticking at it and working hard to find out how she could deal with what I had written, because I see Martha nodding her head. It was probably isn't very, very literate or very whatever, but it is me. And again, one of the things that I have tried to do in whatever book I've done, I've tried to make it that if you read it, and anyone who knows me, you're listening to me. Right or wrong, good or bad, you're listening to me, as opposed to listening to what the editor writes or what might be grammatically correct or what might be particularly acceptable in literary terms. If you read the book from me, you're reading me. And I felt that was an important part of the book. And I've felt the same with the other two books that I've done. So Kate was really, really sort of stuck at it. And we had lots of good Zoom chats and discussions about that very thing. And eventually she became really very on side, to the extent that I would say that there are just about everyone listening to this sort of talk now, and I include Sue, my wife, who's sitting in a chair across there listening to this. And I have to be careful, but I'm good at doing some things and I'm bad at doing others. And I'm very good at doing some things, but equally one of the strengths in, as everyone knows in any sort of business or any life that they've gone through, the important thing in managing what you're good at is knowing equally what you're not good at and being able to get someone to do the stuff that you're. I have been lucky enough through my life of riding to have Sue with me doing all the things that make my life of riding and teaching and coaching work. I'm looking at 2 or 3 people who have run clinics for me, and running a clinic is one of those situations that I don't like doing. But I'm really grateful to the people that take it on and run it and manage it, because it gives me a chance to focus on what I'm good at, which is actually taking it. And so the book was one of those collaborations between the graphic designer, the cartoonist, Kate, and ultimately then up to Becca and to Martha for the final bit of putting the whole package together. And books are not just, they don't just sort of happen, as Martha would know perfectly well. There's a long lead in and run in time. So you sit down and you write, and if you're not used to sitting down and writing, when I'm not the most literate person, actually disciplining yourself to sit down for 3 hours and write is quite difficult, because you've got to just sit and write. Even if it doesn't come easy, you've got to sit and write. And then you send off to the editor what you've written, and immediately comes back what looked just like your school homework, full of red ink all over the place, full of corrections and full of, yes, but there are gaps here and there are gaps there. So you write more and you write more and you write more. But once you get into the way of it, and you see where you're trying to go with that book, it's very fulfilling. And it's even more fulfilling when you really get into the sort of thought process of the structure of what you want to say. And so I quite enjoyed at the end of it doing the book. And there was another book there, and that was sort of really satisfying for me to feel that there was another book in there, and that Trafalgar Books were sort of comfortable with it, and that they trusted me to do that. So I'm grateful to the system for allowing me to do it. I'm surprised that I did it, but I'm pleased that I did it. And I think the end result certainly pleases me, and I hope it pleases those that read it. And I hope Martha gets sort of good enough reports about books of the book and how it's received. Those are always things people sort of say, or Sue always asks me about a clinic. Did you have a good day's teaching? And I say, there's no point asking me. I always enjoy it. Ask the people that were there. They're the ones who will tell you whether it was a good day or a bad day. And so, as Taylor would know, I would always end the day by saying, well, and Taylor will hear the barn chat or the trailer chat and hear the goods and the bads and the ifs and the buts and the do's and the don'ts and yes and no's. And most of the time, people seem to have had fun. So I hope people enjoy the concept of the book and how it's actually turned out, because I have.
So you just, in a way, covered your starting point for the book. And the book opens with find a start point.
Yeah. And
Makes a lot of sense.
well, finding a start point is always one of those sort of things that's, I use that expression, finding a start point, for many, many different sort of thought processes. One of them, because this is a reschooling and a re-education sort of thing, you got to find somewhere that there's common ground with the coach to the pupil to the horse. If you don't find a common ground, then you really do have problems. Not only finding common ground to move forward with, but also finding secure ground that you can begin with to build something that is going to be lasting for the future. So the two words start point I use in all sorts of ways, because the word start point, and I try and explain in the book, is finding that place that the horse feels comfortable with their knowledge. The communication from the rider to the horse is clearly understood, and that in any moment of crisis, they can both return to that start point and say, okay, I didn't understand what you've just done, but let's go back to the start point, and I understand there, let's move forward from there. So the two words start point for me can be used in all sorts of different ways. And most of it is trying to find the common ground that everyone can move forward with understanding, because without that, there's a lot of guesswork going on. And when guesswork goes on, it's a very unstable foundation for any lasting educational process. And I would include that in some of the school education processes that's happen your side of the pond and my side of the pond and elsewhere. The education process, I think, is flawed in so many ways that it gets stuck to a curriculum, and we actually sort of end up with an awful lot of pupils of the younger age going through a guesswork process of trying to find out what they're supposed to be doing in life. And that doesn't lead for a particularly stable existence as they go through their teens or thereafter. So education for me has to be very clear from the very beginning. And if we don't do that, we lead ourselves into many problems, as we do in the training of horses. A lot of the problems that we have to solve are already self-created in the education we try and give the horse.
I love that section about finding this common ground and it becoming kind of a touchstone to return to, you know, as especially if you have a retraining project too, to sort of help confidence also.
And the retraining is something that we do so much of, because in America, there's an awful lot of retraining of the retired racehorses or the racehorses that come off the track. In in our life, there's an awful lot of horse sales that there's retraining to go through, that you get you get this sort of baggage of all sorts of problems that come your way. Some are horse problems that they have anyway. Some are created by the previous rider. Some you'll create, and so the retraining, the start point is very important.
Did you have a question, Karen?
Well, yes. What do you do in this situation where the horse is smarter than you are? I say that most of the people here know, I started at a later age, and I have a very well-trained horse who knows a lot more than I do how to ride. And sometimes it's difficult because she knows what to do, and she knows that I don't necessarily know what to do. Does that make sense? And so there's this
perfect sense. One of the things that I would say to Karen is that then you need to create your own start point. And most riders are uncomfortable with doing that because they are unsure about where that start point is. And all the time, regardless of who is at a clinic, I'll bring people back to a very simple start point and ask even the most fancy rider or fancy horse to do simple tasks. And by doing the simple tasks, you're actually saying to the horse, okay, you might be a bright horse, you might be a clever horse, you might be an educated horse, you might be a horse that knows more than me. But if I ask you a simple question, you actually then have to produce a reciprocal answer to that question. And once you begin to focus on that thought process, the horse then understands that the question you ask is fair and reasonable and deserves a good answer. If that happens, you put in a building block into the process. You then do another simple task. And so you build a whole process of simple tasks, and the horse has to respond. So you don't ask them for complicated. And if it's a simple task, as the rider learns, so they develop a confidence and a much more positive attitude and feel that it's fair for them to ask the horse the question. And so you then don't feel intimidated by your lack of understanding, because it's a simple process to go through. And the difficulty sometimes is having confidence to go back 2 or 3 steps to that sort of start point, that less complicated exercise or task. But that's how I always started. And it's also quite an interesting way to for the horse to understand how you communicate. Because so often, and I'll talk about it shortly, so often the communication is too complicated for the rider to do and for the horse to understand. And so that too begins to create doubt between the two. But if we make our communication a very simple, straightforward communication, not only does the coach have an easier job, but the rider has an easier job, and the horse then has an easier job. On page 8 of the book, I put 4 pictures, which I thought were very relevant, very appropriate to people watching horses. They need to watch horses and look at horses' expressions, because from the ground, as a coach, as a trainer, and as a rider, I'm watching for those expressions, because those expressions are the horse saying, do you know what you're telling me is nonsense, and it's ready for an argument. That top left-hand picture, try me. That's one that's in for a fight. So there's no point trying to educate that one at that moment. And then you get the other one. Sure, no problem. And that's the one that says, fine, anything you like, not a problem. I'm for it. It might not know what you want, but it's game to have a try. And then you get the two at the bottom that you need to be a little bit more attentive to, because one's about to go to the try me bit and the other is about to go to the sure no problem bit. So maybe and maybe not. And I just thought that illustrated our thought process, that we need to watch horses, not just look at them, but we need to watch, because they are going to tell us. They're going to tell us how comfortable they are in the receiving what we're asking them to do. Does that sort of give you a little bit of a way forward?
Yes.
And there's more to come on that when I sort of talk about language, because
Yeah,
that's not.
language be good. You know, when you talked about simple tasks, you also talked about, you know, simple words. And one thing I thought of when I read that in here was simple words like, it's just a gymnastic exercise. Like, keeping things simple is also just easier to remember, especially when you get older. But also when you're going cross country, you know, so you know, I know that you spend a lot of time talking about language, and those of us that have been in Eric's clinics know about Eric's questions and honing in on the words that you chose, that you go through in here, and their meaning, and breaking it down into a simple language so that we're all on the same page.
I think if I digress for a little bit, I'm going to read a little bit. I'm not really used to reading in public or reading to people, but I will read a little bit from page 9 to 10 for a second. As coaches, we need to understand how humans learn at each stage of their development and meet them at their level. The trick is to use appropriate language to make sure that we teach, that what we teach is understood by every student. Often people don't want to admit that they don't understand for fear of appearing stupid. I was certainly like that when I was younger, but this reticence leads to guesswork and further misunderstanding. The responsibility for understanding falls mostly with the coach. Words matter. Experts should strive to explain complicated and weighty subjects in layman's terms so that the ordinary person can feel involved, engaged, and enthused, but all too often they fail. The expert is proud to be known as an expert. It is an acknowledgement that the expert has made it in their profession. They receive certain status and be rewarded for their endeavors. They tend to mix easily with other experts. It sort of makes a members only club. They talk in a certain knowing language that only those who have reached the dizzying heights of being an expert can really understand. When the public listens to experts talk, there is an air of respect that pervades. We admire the confidence, the lofty language, and the grasp of the topic so eloquently explained. But underneath there is another thought that is far too embarrassing for most people to admit, that they haven't understood a single word. And all too often, we end up with coaches teaching. And I listen to coaches, and I've been to coaches, to clinics, and I've been to shows at European Championship level, at Groton House. I've listened to trainers, and I've listened to trainers try and communicate. I remember one time at Groton House, there was before the dressage, and I listened to this wonderfully eloquent trainer, and the words that he was using were straight out of the expert's textbook. And I thought, he must be teaching quite a high-powered pupil. And I looked over to the little colored pony, which was trotting up and back, trying to go on the left rein. There was no concept whatsoever in the rider's mind that they had any idea what a diagonal was, let alone what inside leg to outside rein meant, what rhythm meant, what suppleness meant, what collection meant, what any words that this guy was using actually meant. And I appreciated at that stage, and I've seen it elsewhere, so often that actually the expert is teaching for the assembled audience and the person that's paying the bill. You've got to sound knowledgeable to be an expert. And this was one of the many times that made me think over the years, that's just a pointless form of education. Unless you are able to communicate with words that mean something to the person that you're teaching. And that's not meant to sound patronizing in any way, that they're incapable of understanding. It's nothing to do with that. It's that let's use a language that is straightforward and simple. And so often we don't understand the words that are used by the coach, but we don't want to admit it. There are words that are used all the time by every coach: rhythm, suppleness, impulsion, bend, straightness, collection, contact, half halt, outside rein. You can go through lists of them. And actually, very few riders have an understanding of what those words really mean. They think they do, but as some of you have experienced with my rather direct questioning, it's meant to put you on a spot. It's meant to be a little bit uncomfortable for you, and I will always try and help you out when I think you're squirming a little bit more than you should do, but I'll always help you out to find a way forward with that language, because unless we talk with a common language, words that we understand and words that do make sense, we're doomed in our equestrian world. And then the one that's always left to suffer is the horse, because they're guessing. They're guessing what we want from that word. And if they're guessing, then the chances are you're going to get the right answer sometimes, but you're also going to get the wrong answer lots of times. And if the rider's not sure what they asked for and the horse is not sure what they give, then it's very easy for the rider to blame the horse. And actually, it might not have been the horse's fault. The horse might have not learned that language. He might not have read that page in that book that day that you were going to teach that subject. So it's unfair. And I'm very conscious, even more so nowadays, that our social license to ride horses is much more under scrutiny. And we need to be very conscious that we are being fair to our horses. And if we're being fair to our horses, then they have much more chance of having a better life. But that requires the right language. So the language I chose, which is also part of the formula for the book, is the words that I use. And you'll have heard these before, Taylor and Annie, certainly, that forward, straight and regular are simple riding qualities. And they're simple riding qualities, they're practical words that you actually have to involve yourself in doing. Forward, straight and regular. Well, forward's the basis of everything. Put the horse on the line, because we're all tested by line, whether we're going for a trail ride and following a track, or whether we're following a course and following the numbers, or whether we're going, we're all judged on the line we ride. And so it's forward on that line. And if we want to be judged again, we have to keep it pretty regular. And that seems a fairly straightforward riding quality to begin with. So I start with everything in that sort of thought process. And that allows us all to come to our start point onto the common page and begin from the same point. So that was how we sort of get going into the book.
Yep, then you talk about the 5 stages, allowing us to sort of find us, once you have your start point, you start asking yourselves questions so you can develop step-by-step process, right, to address your problem.
Correct. One of the things that I do in every clinic, I sit and I watch, or I stand and I watch, and I'm talking to people and I watch them do simple thought processes. the first thing is I have to sort of listen to what they say, because I always ask people to tell me about the two things they like about the horse and the one thing they'd like to make better. The two things they like, it's actually quite fun to hear people talk about a positive about their horse. Some people find that difficult. It's quite entertaining listening to people talk, you know, trying to find nice things about their horses. Oh, I love the color. When you're down to that, you're really stuck. When they talk about their horses in a positive way, and then I say, and tell me one thing you'd like to make better. At the same time, when we head off into the first few minutes of the lesson, I'm assessing what their problems are, and I'm trying to get into the root of the problem. I then also try, if I possibly can, look into or listen to what they've said, how that problem has arisen. It may have been a schooling problem they've inherited, it may have been something, but it's quite nice to know how that problem arose. If you know how it arose, then you've more chance of trying to solve the problem. And from a training point of view, that's quite helpful. Then it's also quite important, why do we need to solve that problem? Some people give you problems at the beginning and tell you something quite irrelevant. And so it may not need to be solved in the first place. It might need to be, but it might not be. If you do a positive process, that problem might disappear in the fulfillment of the positive process. So it's not always that you do have a problem, but sometimes it disappears with good riding. But it's nice to know why it's there, or it's nice to know why you need to solve it. And then you start to sort of formulate some sort of a plan. And then at the end of it, the fifth phase is giving people some homework, giving people some thought process that they can measure whether the problem has been resolved, or if it reappears, how to go about resolving it and reconfirming some of the processes you've put in place for solving it at stage 4. So you have a sort of a process. And if riders have that process, then the riding of the horse when they don't have a trainer or a coach becomes much more straightforward, because you're able to give them homework and give them tools that they're able to solve the process. And those of you again who've had lessons, one of the ways that I try and do that is giving people words which relate to dressage words that they have in the scoring system on the top left hand of your dressage sheet. At the same time, the words are relating to numbers. We're all graded from 0 to 10 in our movements that we do. If you get people used to riding and saying, oh, what's that worth? Well, it's worth a 5 because it's sufficient. It's actually worth a little bit more. It's a 6, so it's satisfactory. It's 7, it's fairly good. It's 8, it's good. It's 9, it's very good. It's 10, it's excellent. If people relate to those words and use those words in how they relate to the way the horse feels, they become their own trainers. They become their own coaches. And that's all part of the assessment stage in how people begin to do that assessment process. So that's why those little five sort of processes are an important part to that process.
I was going to point out that throughout the book, you can see in the table of contents, there is lists of problems. And then throughout the book, there is this process applied to each of those problems. And it is very simple. You know, it's actually empowering to read, you know, popping the left shoulder, and you give simple steps in that. So I, you know, just thought I'd mention all the problems that are addressed in this book, and how much I appreciated how manageable they become by applying the 5 steps to those situations.
I think Annie, people have to go away from something like this with a structure. some sort of structure that they can go away and work themselves. Not everyone has a trainer with them all the time. And very often you go home and you ride around, and actually you ride around your school or your field, your corner of every field. And if someone was to be sitting on your shoulder and saying, "What are you doing?" A lot of people
They would
a
say
lot
that.
of people,
No, yeah.
a lot of people would laugh as you've laughed and say, "Not a lot. I'm enjoying the scenery. And your horse is just going around minded neutral, sort of saying, 'Fine, it's another day at the office, and they'll be fed in 20 minutes. That's fine.'" But what are you doing? It's quite a challenging question, and it's meant to be, because I use that again, saying, "What are you doing?" You need to have some structure to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you practice and you spend time practicing, but you could be practicing all the problems. You could be practicing things that don't work. You could be practicing things that the horse doesn't need to know. You could be practicing something that compounds the problem. So why not have a structure to it all and practice the things that help the horse to do what you want a little bit better? And by going through that sort of process with each of the problems, and there are many other problems that I didn't put in, and the book would be yay thick.
Volume 2. Job security.
So you need to have some sort of structure, even if the structure is just how to move whatever mark you got at the last dressage test you did from a 7 to a 7.5, or a 7 to an 8, or a 5 to a 6. Just from what the judge said, it's quite nice to be able to move that forward and say, okay, well, I've practiced that. I should actually be a little bit better. And use the words, use the simple words, and think of the thought process. And the horse is actually very happy to accommodate that thought process. They quite like structure, and they quite like some sort of a plan. They'll fill the void, if there is a void, with stuff that they do. But actually, it's quite nice to fill the void for them with stuff that we would like to do. And they're quite happy to do that. Most horses are generous animals, and they'll be very accommodating. So that's why that sort of whole thing works that way.
Anybody have any questions? At this point? On 120, you talk about how the rider influences connection.
Yeah.
So you can read that?
Well, I'm not going to read that because okay, I'll read it a little bit. It talks about balance, and balance is one of those things that most coaches end up talking about position, and they tend to fix positions. But I don't do that as much as others, because everyone's very different, and so to me, balance is more important than position. And I was tickled when Becca sort of commented on that to me one time when I sort of sent the book to her. She said, "That's unusual. Most people talk about putting riders into positions, whereas I try and find a balance." I start off by saying good balance is a fundamental requirement in all sports to be efficient, let alone good. Before hitting a golf ball, tennis ball, soccer ball, or even running, the balance in one's body is important to take into account. As a sport's demands increase, any imbalances causes us to work that much harder to do what the balanced athlete does with ease. We work against our natural biomechanics and use muscle power instead of coordination. The result is often diminished performance and an increased likelihood of injury. A good example of an extraordinarily balanced athlete is the tennis player Roger Federer, who has remained uninjured for most of his career. And in fact, the interesting thing on that particular example, the reason the last 3 years of Roger Federer he's been struggling with a knee operation, a knee sort of issue. Does anyone actually sitting there know how he got the knee injury? Anyone know?
A horse?
No, Ken.
Stepping off a curb.
He got his knee injury taking his child, helping his child out of the bath, and he slipped, and damaged his knee. If he hadn't done that, the chances of him winning a number of more Grand Slams and being up with Nadal and Djokovic and still pushing for 23, 24 Grand Slams was highly likely still to be there. And that balance of an athlete is important. So that particular bit and the thought process of the rider being relevant to the way the horse goes is another part that I dwell on towards the end once we've sort of gone through some of the other thought processes. But it's important at this stage, Annie, when you think about balance and the rider, that if I then go back to the forward, straight and regular, my next sort of three sort of words were contact, connection and consistency. They provide the next sort of 3 chapters, because without a good balance, contact is very difficult to achieve. Without a good balance, it's difficult to be able to influence the horse's hind legs and use your aids to do that, to produce connection. Without a good balance, it's very difficult to then produce the consistency which allow you to stay the same, which scores marks. If you stay the same on a 20-meter circle and it's the same trot or canter the whole way around the circle, you're going to have a better start point to be able to move a 6 to a 7 than if you're unable to keep your balance. If you can't produce a consistent canter, the arrival at a jump becomes even more inconsistent, which allows for the horse to have even more uncertainty of takeoff and allows the jump to be even more inconsistent and likely of having a pole down. So the rider balance is important to the communication to produce the 3 C's, as well as forward, straight and regular. The rider's ability to communicate is improved hugely by being able to be in balance. Maybe not correct, but if you get a 6'6" guy like Fox Pitt eventing and someone who is Roz Cantor, who is 5 foot nothing in her high heels, and both of them are top riders, they're world championship type riders, and you can't say that their positions are the same because they're not. But they're both very balanced riders and very good at communicating, and the horses understand what they're saying. So I needed to dwell on that little bit of balance game and thought process of the rider, because if you can't understand and appreciate that thought process, then the efficiency of the communication is diminished hugely. So that was why I thought that would be a nice topic to bring in towards the end of the book.
What are good ways to make your balance better?
Rebalance.
No, I meant off the.
The board.
Off the horse, the balance board. There are dimensions. Get your local carpenter to make one. They're very easy, and they sit just inside your front door or up in your bedroom, and you can spend 5 minutes morning and night playing on the balance board, and your balance will be improved immeasurably, purely and simply because your subconscious takes over and you don't think about your balance. You think about finding your balance, and your subconscious takes over.
What's it balanced on? what, I see the balance board in the back of the book, but what is it? What is it on top of? Is it on top of a round thing or a?
No, no, it's not on top of a round thing. You see those round things at in gyms. They're a very different thought process. The dimensions are there. It's not very difficult for someone who has a little bit of acumen with carpentry to make, and that's why I put it in there. It's something I designed 35 years ago, and I bring it. I used to bring it to clinics and play with it because it puts you in a position with your heel 1.5 inches lower than the ball of your foot. It puts you in a position that your whole body is aligned over the ball of your foot, which is where it should be on the stirrup. And you immediately find your subconscious finding your balance. That gives you something which is loosely termed as muscle memory, and muscle memory allows you then to find the balance. So that's how to do it.
Yeah,
That's why I put it in.
you'd also, I mean, you had a picture of the rider from behind, I think that illustrated, we often aren't self-aware to even know when we're a little off kilter. And I think that also reflects into, you mentioned horses being stronger one-sided also. So we're both horse and rider are reverting to a comfortable position that's not necessarily balanced.
Absolutely, and I'm very conscious when I sort of go to clinics and I watch people who have spent and this, I'm sorry, Annie, this is a bad topic. But I who spend thousands on saddles, but
It can help.
they're just sitting crooked anyway, so it doesn't matter what saddle they get. Saddles are helpful, and that was one reason, Annie, why I asked you for the name of the saddle maker which you gave me, and I asked and talked to her, and she was very helpful. I've quoted her in the book a number of times. That saddles can be a problem, saddles can be a help, but saddles are not a cure. Balance is a cure for all sorts of ills, and saddles are there to help you find a balance, but they're not the only way that they will help you. Once you find a balance, and the saddle should encourage that and put you in and leave you in a comfortable balance, life is so much easier for communication. And I see so often dressage saddles that put people in a position that is so detrimental to any communication and any sort of thought process of balance that really they'd be better riding on a postage stamp.
I agree completely. And I also believe that when riders are seeking security, security doesn't come from the big blocks and the deep seats. Security comes from balance of the saddle. So
for sure. And I had my Body Beautiful rider there who was able to sort of pose in that nice sort of way. But I was also very conscious that I needed to put in 3 different shapes of people, because there are people who are challenged in their own balance and in their own physique. But if I have those people on clinics, I most certainly don't dwell on those issues. But everybody is able to find a balance if we're able to play with certain sort of certain rules from a coaching point of view, and take away some of the misconceptions that people have of putting their heel down, for example. The second you put your heel down too far, you're going to lose your balance, because the lower leg goes forward, the upper body goes back, and the shoulders then tip forward to try and find some compensation. And so you end up losing your balance. But if you have your heel 2 centimeters or 1 inch below the ball of your foot and you have your knee above your toe, the chances are you'll find your balance. And so the balance board, Karen, is one of those sort of things that get someone to make it, and you'll find it very helpful. And you don't have to tell people what you're doing. You can do it quietly by yourself.
Well, I do that with most things anyhow. So do I.
Now that when you were not
saying, thank you.
Do you want to just finish up with talking about throughness?
Yeah, throughness was one of those things the diagram on page 44 was one of those diagrams that I've used for such a long time. I never changed it because it's such a simple diagram, and throughness is where there is no resistance from legs, quarters, back, pole, jaw, bit, hand. All too often with the training and the retraining, we get resistance somewhere along that little sort of cycle, that little circle that goes from leg to hand. And it's the understanding of the word resistance is important, because people talk about suppleness when actually they should be talking about resistance, because horses are by and large are perfectly supple. They were born supple and they remain supple throughout their life. They can turn right, turn left, and do what you like, and they can dance and turn over backwards. They can do anything you like. Watch them out in the field when they're sporting, they're playing. But the second you put tack on them and the rider asks them to do things, they become resistant for whatever reason, either as a safety measure or as a conditioned reflex that they've always done that and no one's ever taught them a different way, or they've always been lazy to the leg because no one has ever taught them to be forward, or they've always never used their hind legs because they have a physical issue with their hocks, or they've never actually been taught to push from their hind legs. So the concept of throughness, which everyone seeks to be a better athlete, and the horse that is through is a much more useful animal to all of us. It comes back to the acceptance and understanding of the rider's aid. But if the rider doesn't know what the aid is or how to correct it, then the horse just carries on as he was always doing, being resistant to whatever aid. So again, we turn full circle. We're back to the use of language and the use of understanding the language, that we don't get throughness if we don't have the language. We don't get throughness if we don't understand that there's the first part of the question is initiated by the leg aids and it returns to the rein aid. And each link in that chain needs to be understood by the horse and the rider, otherwise throughness won't happen. And that's why I was grateful that you allowed me to use that picture of a less than perfect conformation of a back and a horse. But when he worked, he was so totally through that he just did some lovely, lovely work. And so it's nothing to do with confirmation or making excuses for this, that, and the other thing. It's purely the education of the horse and the education of the rider and the use of the correct education from the coach to the rider and horse that allows that word throughness to be understood, and for us all to feel horses that are through, because they're much nicer to ride, they're much less demanding, and they're much more efficient and become much better at their chosen profession. So I just thought it was worth sort of drawing that. All the other sort of chapters that go into detail, a little bit more detail about some of the problems, they are there to highlight the problems, to try and give you tools to correct the problems. But unless you understand the preliminary thought process about words and communication and that sort of thing, they're not so easy to understand. And that was where Kate helped me quite a bit in the format of the book, and how together we ended up coming with a format that by and large follows the legs, quarters, back pull, jaw bit, hand, because that sums up and goes through the forward, straight and regular and the 3 words of the 3 C's. So that was why I just thought throughness was an interesting topic to end with.
It's great. Thank you, Eric.
Not at all. Thank you for listening, and thank you for asking questions.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I'll get on mute again, sorry.
You can cut the recording. Oh, we lost Eric. What happened?
No, I'm still here.
Oh.
Still here.
I thought we might have, without the recording, just, people chat and say hello, Eric, or ask questions if you like to.